Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, and indeed good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our Composable Architecture session that we've had in the diary. We brought this to you by popular demand, actually, from a number of sources. People have asking lots of questions on this particular topic, so we thought we would grab a selection of experts, put them in a room, and have some good, honest discussions about all things composable from that perspective. So, first of all, I'd like to just introduce the two companies. So, first of all, from our guest side of things, we have QuadCorps. So, QuadCorps are an innovative, growing consultancy. They are very much in the sort of integration and sort of ecosystem challenge from that perspective. They're very good at knitting together these complex problems across organizations, and they work with a variety of companies all over the UK and Europe from that perspective. And ourselves, you may know already, we are a boutique consultancy house helping organizations through business transformation journeys, typically using SAP as a backbone. So without further ado, let us introduce the rest of the team around us. So maybe Vaughan, Gil and Chris, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll start. Morning, everyone. My name is Vaughan Habertle. I'm a co-founder of QuadCorps, and like Neil said, we operate in the integration and API kind of ecosystem.
I'll go next. I'm Gil Perry. I'm also a co-founder of QuadCorps, and obviously working exactly the same space as Vaughan, unsurprisingly.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, everybody. Again, like Neil says, depending on where you are in the world, I won't repeat what QuadCorps do, but for all intents and purposes, commercial director at QuadCorps. If you do have any questions, queries, things that you want to kind of find out a little bit more about us or what's been discussed afterwards from a QuadCorps perspective, feel free to reach out to me. There's various things around me, plus I know a lot of people know me anyway or message me on LinkedIn. So yeah, just give us a shout if there's anything you want to pick up afterwards. But yeah, looking forward to the session.
Great stuff. And from a Limelight perspective, Gordon, Darren and Brian, I think, is in the wing somewhere as well.
So I'll go first, yeah. So Darren Nicholson, I'm the sales director here at Limelight. So equally, as Chris said, feel free to reach out any questions, further information required. I don't have any luxury banners. I do apologise. I shall address that for next time. Thank you very much. Over to my colleagues.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gordon Kelly, part of the exec team at Limelight. And I look after a lot of our delivery and architecture capability within the organisation. I'm currently in the middle of the Highlands on a fairly dodgy Wi-Fi connection. So if I do drop out audio-wise or video-wise, please forgive me and I'll rejoin as soon as possible. I think Brian is going to join us shortly. Neil, he's not on the call right this very second.
Perfect. Okay, great. Well, let's crack on. So composable architecture, let's set some context from that perspective, really. So and maybe Gil, why don't you introduce this topic to the group, I suppose, really from that perspective, really. So what is the core kind of concept of composable architecture, if that makes sense?
Yeah, cheers, Neil. Yeah, for me, it's the ability to assemble a solution from a set of components that are independent and replaceable, and should be able to, using that, you should be able to break down complex problems into small reusable components, and you can think of those as like building blocks. And then you want businesses then combine those together and reconfigure them to create new applications and new problems. And so those components, they should operate independently, but they should be able to communicate with each other through through well-defined interfaces.
Okay, so so those interfaces then, do they how's that kind of different from what we have today in today's world, and that from that perspective, because we have systems today that talk talk to one another, and what is it about composable that makes it so unique, I guess, from that perspective?
I think with composable interfaces, it's about extracting the underlying services that are being used, so you can have some common contracts. So if, for instance, I know you might have a video transcoder, for instance, if you don't want the underlying implementation to bleed into the contract. So if you're composing, if you want to create a new video transcoder, should use the same contract. So you should be able to compose those easily without the actual things orchestrating those kind of reinventing the wheel.
Okay, so it's designed to be I'm going to use the word sort of multifaceted, I guess, really, in that case. Then, so you literally can pick up and plug something else into the same kind of interface. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, that's how I see it. Absolutely, Neil.
No, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Gil, have you got Vaughan? Have you got a view on that?
Yeah, I'd probably add to that. So I think one of the things that sets kind of composable components apart is that there's a focus on their business capability. It's easy to write something technically that has an API that you can call, but for something to be composable, it needs to be able to be called from a wide variety of clients for potentially slightly different use cases. It probably needs to be configurable so that depending on how you configure it, you get different behavior out of it. From a technical perspective, you still have an API and, like you said, a well-defined interface, but there's a lot more care taken in terms of the business capability, the boundaries, the business boundaries, the context of that component, and then obviously how it's implemented as well.
Okay, so it's predominantly around sharing business data, I guess, really around the organization in a lot more of an effective manner, on a real-time basis, I presume, as well. Yeah,
I guess the services themselves would operate on a potentially real-time basis. In terms of the composability of them, how they are composed would vary depending on an organization, the components themselves, how they're written, how they're implemented. But the capability of the components very often would be real-time. To compose a new process, a new business process, for example, should be relatively simple. It shouldn't require a massive amount of development, but that might not necessarily be real-time. It depends on how things have been put together, I guess.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. and Gordon, to bring that across into the sort of ERP world, it sounds a little bit like the ERP modules talking to one another from that perspective.
Well, I think from an ERP point of view, of course, it's kind of a pretty big jump. I'm an old man at this stage, but ERPs traditionally used to be, and SAP from our perspective, pretty transactional. Even if I think about how SAP is laid out for an end user back in the day, it used to be very transactional. And in recent years, that's changed. It's more process-centric now. When a user interacts with an ERP, SAP, in the case of a lot of the work that we're involved in, it's much more process-centric now. But it's still a platform, a software package that is integrated across all of its capabilities, and it doesn't come from a place historically of being modularized such that the process flow can be tweaked or changed. If I think about easily, I should say, I think about the kind of phrase I've heard around this is that we put a lot of effort and time, and clients put a lot of money into implementing ERPs, things that are built to last rather than built to change. Whereas I think possibly the underlying principle around this composable idea is that things are built to change. We're able to see a business process held together with lots of steps where those capabilities can be swapped out, improved, scaled. And from an ERP point of view, that's exciting, but I think we're kind of just really getting on the journey of that now, because SAP and other ERP platforms traditionally have had a wall-to-wall model with interfaces out to other services. But to be able to be really modularized to the extent that either with no or with limited technical investment, you can make changes rapidly, that's quite new. So it is exciting from that point of view. And things can be achieved now. But I do think it's probably still relatively early in the ERP world in terms of how I see it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I've definitely seen some new releases from SAP that try and help us on the journey, but I definitely think it's a learning curve that the industry is still on, I think, from that perspective. So Gil and Vaughan, maybe can you give us some sort of real world examples of how companies that have gone through this journey and have decided to approach it in this manner, and sort of the success stories, if you like, from that perspective?
Yeah, I can think of a customer we've had where they had what was at the time actually a manual process. So it was a big media company, and they had a manual process where they'd receive content, a movie or something, a program, and they would then have to process that through various steps before it got broadcast. And the original process was manual, so they had a tape that they would kind of receive with a movie on it, and they would then take that tape and put it into a machine, and the machine would do something to it. It might quality control it, or it might what's called transcode it, which is kind of changing the format of it. And they went from a manual process and a bunch of legacy systems to a composable architecture, where they defined at a business level, identified the steps that any kind of media need to go through before broadcast. They defined the context around that, and then they wrote a composable. They had a composable architecture that they could pull together different steps in different orders with components that they could configure to give slightly different results. So, for example, if they had a new platform where they wanted to broadcast some content, they would be able to take their existing components, reconfigure them for that platform, and without fundamentally changing or writing new code. And they would then be able to take the movie, for example, and have it go through a new part through these composable components, and resulting in fundamentally a different end product, a different movie that was playable on a different platform, with a different format, with different metadata. And they could do that without actually writing any code. So that's an example of the benefits, of a composable architecture, is being able to create new processes or put building blocks together in different ways without writing reams and reams of code.
That's interesting.
Sorry, Neil, maybe just ask you a quick follow-up question. Sorry, a little bit building on that, I suppose. Are there areas where, that's a really good real-world example, are there areas that you see your customers speak to you about that are a priority for treating in this way over others? So certain parts of their business process, I'm thinking a little bit in our experience would be that the areas that a customer really wants to look at this stuff is in areas of differentiation. So, for example, in their purchasing process, they may be completely uninterested in trying to do this because actually it's pretty stable and they do purchasing the same as any other business. But for the thing that they sell or make, or where they generate a difference from another company, that's where they're interested in how can we compose this differently and be able to change it. Do you see that type of priority as well?
Yeah, generally it's got to do more with the core business processes than kind of administrative or back-end processes. That's not to say that it doesn't happen in the back end, but generally I would agree that it's more core processes. And it often happens also in certain industries where the business processes are well defined, the steps are well defined, and some businesses have no need. There are some businesses whose business models are fairly fixed. They don't change. They don't need to react to market conditions. They've got something and they do it. But there's a lot of companies, like I say, where speed to market, getting a relative advantage or competitive advantage kind of propels them in the market. It's those areas where the technology or composable architectures are most sought after.
I think we've also seen in recent years, I think Vaughan, like a few retailers we've been working with use things like API-led connectivity, which is a form of composability, cloud native, and recently using architecture that conforms like the Mac architecture to enable business agility and innovation. So they've been using that composable architecture, and they've been leveraging best of breed SaaS solutions. And then also as a result of that, where they're heading into some real high volume traffic and this is a facet of composable architecture rather than being composable, but as part of that, because they're using things like microservices, they're able to scale out Black Friday and handle the kind of massive demand compared to what would be a BAU kind of day. So it's another kind of real world example of where they've been using composable architecture and kind of benefit from it as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, certainly retail appears to be a right picking, should we say, for this market, and that industry certainly seems to have jumped on to the composable journey faster than others. Why do you think that is?
I suspect it's because the retail process is very similar across different types of retail. I guess you've got quite well defined requirements. You need to manage inventory, you need to handle payments, you need to have a basket. So the components themselves are fairly consistent across different retail businesses. They're well defined. There's often a need to, depending on a company's strategy, there might be a need to at times as companies grow, swap out one system for another. So the ability to have, for argument's sake, a payment capability and a payment service that is composable, but the back end can be swapped out for by different payment providers or payment gateways, or support multiple gateways, for example, depending on where they're selling and that kind of thing. I think the retail process is defined enough and common enough to make it relatively simple to have composable architectures, but the variation and the need to reinvent itself and to change and to offer more personalization and more products also drives the need for that flexibility and getting things done faster.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Vaughan. I think and typically in e-commerce they have more of a driver to adapt to changing market trends and customer preferences, because they have to make that kind of, have to be more agile. They are always kind of front facing and needing to innovate more frequently, I would say, than in other industries.
Yeah, that's pretty a fair statement. So this question from Simon, actually. Oh, sorry, go on, Gordon.
So I was just going to say, there's one, I guess one of the things about that sort of example, and the example area of a business, retail, the front end, what the customer is seeing and reacting to, that's the competitive side of things. There is also, I think, again, thinking back from our side, sometimes in an ERP world, there are other examples I can think of. So if anyone has had the pleasure of doing business in Brazil, or having an entity which has a representation in Brazil, it's very, very complicated in terms of the business environment there. The tax processing, the regulatory framework changes every 20 minutes, but it changes at pace. And one of the things that SAP has done over the years is allowed you to build that knowledge into SAP and have to change it all of the time to keep it up to date. Whereas now, effectively, with SAP S/4HANA, it basically asks an external service to do that and brings it back in sort of real time. What are the taxes that need to apply here? Okay, that's an integration right now. But again, you're starting to see this idea that in the flow of the business process at that point, where there's a complexity that's outside of our control that might be changing at pace rapidly, we need to be able to have a component, something that is always right, and we can change it out, we can scale it. And we don't need to take responsibility for that. It's slightly in a black box at this point in our process. And I do think that's kind of what we're seeing, the evolution, that these kind of tool sets can do that.
Yeah, and Simon's put a good point in the chat here actually as well about where the data is stored. And this is quite an important point, because if we've got data moving all over the place, where is the home of the data? How do you get to kind of like the master data, if that makes sense from that perspective? How do you decide where that's going to be in that kind of structure and that kind of architecture? Gil, that might be one for you, I think.
So it's a good question. Where does the data live, and who owns it? So I think it's in terms of it's probably working out where your domain modeling for each area of the business really, and deciding as a business who masters that data. Because it's what would happen typically in a microservice world is that you might not want to be coupled to that master data all the time. So you might have things like eventual consistency, but you want to know where that data lives and where you can get the kind of that master data from, whether that's customer data or orders. So I think it's about understanding the domain and deciding where it lives, really.
Yeah, no, that seems to make sense. Sorry, go on, Vaughn.
I was going to add to that. So I guess it's important to make a distinction between composable components and microservices, because they're not necessarily the same thing. And I think the microservices support quite well a composable architecture, but you can create something that's composable without using microservices. And I think in terms of where the data lives, that comes down to, if depending on the underlying architecture. So if it's a microservice architecture, the data might live somewhere, different, will be handled differently too if it's what's underlying is not a microservice architecture, for example. So that's one of the most complicated kind of questions to answer, is to identify where the sources of data, the master data, and then figure out how to use it, how to be able to use that data consistently. And that's got less to do with the composability. It's got more to do with, I guess, the underlying infrastructure that's kind of supporting.
Yeah, it makes sense. That makes sense. So I want to sort of move the conversation onto sort of the benefits, really, I suppose, of composable architecture, because it sounds that like there are benefits, and it sounds like there are lots of advantages, and organizations are clearly moving to that kind of model. But what in real terms kind of do you get out of it, I suppose, really? It feels like, I'm going to be a bit controversial here, but it feels like it could be a bit of an IT trend. And how do you kind of justify it, if that makes sense? What's the rationale for moving to that kind of model? What's the benefit, if that makes sense? Gil, maybe do you want to pick that one up?
So yeah, okay, the benefit of moving to the model. Okay, so I think the biggest benefits to moving to that model are obviously composability, your ability to react to changes in this, right? So I think we've spoken about it before. You can compose these services together to create new applications, new services, new business functionality. And I think that's becoming increasingly important. And you're reducing your lead time to market, you're reducing overall cost of ownership. You've also you'll again increase agility. There's that flexibility of being able to rearrange components. You've got the scalability as well. So as part, generally, if we're talking, I think as most people think about composable architecture, a lot of the time, then it's not necessarily microservices, but you're talking about microservices, you've got that ability to scale out as well. And so you can cope with load. You can potentially, if because that ability to scale also can save you money as well, because if you've got elastic scaling, then your business is going to save money on not basically not using unnecessary resources as well.
Yeah, and that's predominantly. I guess that's predominantly to do with the fact that the services can scale on the relevant cloud platform they're hosted on. Is that kind of how it works from that perspective then?
Yeah. So there's various kind of in terms of, probably going back to more microservices, but you could either opt for things like containers, where if you're using Docker and Kubernetes, you can scale out in using the main sort of cloud providers, using potentially managed systems like AKS and EKS. And if you're and they're great, especially if you're using containers, if you want to have it as more technology agnostic and platform agnostic, because then you should be able to move those components to different cloud providers. Or there's serverless, where you don't even have to worry about the infrastructure at all, and you're just really focused on the development of those kind of typically short-lived and especially suited to like event-driven services. So yeah, that I think that's really the benefit of in terms of scaling using either containers or serverless. Really, pretty what you're looking at there.
Yeah. So how much of this is linked to the organizational culture then? Because it sounds like if you can create systems that are flexible, scalable, modular, and you can build them all together in some kind of I'm going to use the word Lego because that's how my simple brain works. Then it feels like it's quite an innovative platform, right? And therefore it's going to rely on the organization being quite open to innovation and playing and testing and failing, and that whole concept of failing fast and all those other types of good things as well. Vaughan, how much of that is important in terms of the cultural fit of this kind of technology into the organization as well?
It is important. Cultural fit is important. I think from my experience, I've seen lots of organizations adopting technologies, but not necessarily being successful because of the way that they structured, because of their culture. And I think in terms of composable, and it's probably true of microservices as well, there needs to be first and foremost an understanding of the business, of the processes and the components that you need to build, and that's something that very often big companies don't always have, or it's kind of siloed. The next thing is that there is a level of complexity that comes with these architectures. They are, if you get them right, they are amazing in terms of all the things you've mentioned, agility and innovation and keeping costs down and reuse. But there is a level of maturity that's required to develop and manage them in a way. It requires a level of discipline. It requires quite a deep understanding of the business and also of the appropriate use of the technologies. And I've seen lots of companies adopt technology and use it to do the wrong thing. So there's a level of understanding that's required to be successful. And there's all kinds of best practices around DevOps and API ops and domain-driven design and all kinds of things you can do using standards to define your contract first kind of interfaces. All of those things need to be built into the organization and the teams that use them. And if the organization is comfortable with that and the culture allows innovation and learning and change, if these tools and these practices are adopted, there's benefit to be had.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. And I just want to call out, Simon had another good question in the comment there, and Gordon, maybe you want to just weigh in on this one as well a little bit more. So the concept of the Lego bricks, for example, if everybody's responsible for their own Lego bricks, Simon raises a very good point. What's the potential risk really if we have different vendors that are responsible for each of the Lego bricks? And Gordon, do you maybe just want to expand on your answer a little bit?
Just recognizing the point that Simon made. It's an important consideration. With the flexibility and responsiveness that we can get by having various components that can be independently scaled or replaced or upgraded and so on, it naturally makes the picture more complicated, ideally under the bonnet. But if there is single ownership of all that, it's very clear. If there's multiple ownership, different partners, these things are typically done with an open standard so that they can be different partners. It needs to be very clear in the real world where the ownership and accountability lies if there's a problem. We all know, I suppose, from our experience, things can go wrong, failures can occur, and we can't have any sort of muddy water around how it would be responded to. So it's an important consideration, I think, in these things. It doesn't outweigh, I'm sure, in well, I suppose it is to be weighed up, but in a lot of cases, it doesn't outweigh the benefit of having that flexibility. But it's an important consideration for sure.
And Gil and Vaughan, how do you normally see that kind of manifest itself in things like support contracts and things like that then? Is there kind of like one umbrella contract for everything that's developed, or how does it kind of work normally?
It would depend very much on an organization and their view of things, how they manage things, how the procurement practices are. I've seen various guises. I think most common is probably that each of the external vendors are managed independently with their own contracts, and it's often down to kind of the IT teams to pull all these things together and to try and coordinate it. And if something goes wrong, then probably the most important thing to have is visibility of what's going on in the system, because that way you can identify the root cause and who's responsible. And that's one of the it's often one of the most neglected parts of composable architectures is the visibility into the system. So we always encourage our clients to invest in as much visibility as they can across the entire ecosystem. So there's various ways of doing that, and there's various tools that support it. But that visualization, the ability to see where things have gone wrong, help keep different vendors and the client themselves kind of accountable.
Yeah, sort of makes perfect sense. The and you kind of touched on an important point there about the support of this. So in my head, I've kind of now got this Lego brick model with some spider webs, if you like, with everything talking and moving around the place. How do you kind of monitor and support this kind of architecture? Is there kind of like some kind of tooling that's specially designed for it, or how does it work from that perspective?
I can take that.
Go for it.
So yeah, I think first off, in terms of you can have a sprawling, even if it's well architected, you can have a sprawling distributed system. So knowing what's going on in that system is of paramount importance. If something goes wrong, you don't want to be calling out a million people, taking an enormous amount of time to resolve that. The meantime to resolution, you want to be able to solve it quickly, know what's going on, have visibility over the system. So observability and monitoring are crucial. I mean, if you don't have that as part of your composable architecture, then you've got real problems. So and that will come down to you hear about the three pillars of logging, tracing, and metrics. So when you have got something that goes wrong, you can identify the journey of a particular let's say a transaction, what systems is hit, and you want the kind of that visibility of where things have gone wrong, or at least be able to trace it back to what has gone wrong, and also have the requisite alerting. So ideally, it'll be something that's proactive and looking at trends rather than reactive as well. If you to get to that level of maturity is ideal, but at least you want to kind of work out what's going wrong and where.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And what about things like so let's say you architect this beautifully intricate spider web of Lego bricks that sort of works around the front end, let's say, of your business. Let's keep it the retail space, because that kind of maybe makes the most sense to a lot of people probably. How do you even think about testing something like this? Because the testing of it must be absolutely fundamental to its success. Vaughan, have you got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, testing in distributed systems in general is challenging. I think it's about having well-defined interfaces, creating mocks that you can kind of test against to begin with. It's about, there's different layers of testing. You can test your infrastructure as well, so you can adopt things like chaos engineering, where there's different tools that will kind of simulate failures in different parts of your infrastructure, or so adopting practices like that kind of simulate more real world scenarios is important. I think that's one of the most difficult things with testing. Is it's fairly easy to test a component in isolation, but to test a system that is distributed, that's made up of multiple components, and is running on potentially infrastructure that in itself is complex and kind of granular, becomes quite difficult to test that in a real world scenario. So chaos engineering is potentially one of the ways of doing that. And it's thinking through, what are your points of failure? I think quite often a lot of teams don't think about what can go wrong. They're focused on, what we call the happy path in getting something functionally working, but you need to think about all of the scenarios, the unhappy paths, and identify those and create tests for those. And I think that's not always done to the degree that it should.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And Brian, just to bring you into the conversation a little bit about design, perhaps. When would you normally consider the design of something like this? In what phase in a program would you normally kind of pick that up, if that makes sense as well?
Yeah, so I think this kind of architectural concept and an introduction of this into your landscape, it's a foundational piece, really, right? So ultimately, this is something that the architecture team needs to be in tune with and listen to what the benefits are, what the vision is, the capabilities that are required from the business, and ultimately from that, I think, as Gordon was kind of alluding to a little bit earlier, the kind of processes that would benefit from having a composable architecture, that we build that into the foundational high-level design in the program. A lot of our background is large business transformation and ERP, SAP programs, and in that speak, it's kind of in that early kind of discovery, define phase of the program that we would expect to see a joining up of the benefits case and the vision with, okay, well, here's the architectural strategy, the concepts that we need to have in place that we give to the teams going into the design phase, and that's a foundational cornerstone of exactly what we're going to be putting together as an overarching solution. So it's very early on in the program, Neil, is the answer. And ultimately it's driven by what the business is trying to achieve.
And Vaughan, how do you see that from I'm going to just say the slightly smaller companies, for example? So the big corporates and the big ERP players, if you like, in that world probably have it a bit harder, quite frankly. But where is kind of the sweet spot really for that kind of design and decision making? How do you kind of convince and start to maneuver that based on the benefits, I guess?
It's tricky. I think in an ideal world, you would look at kind of potentially an integration strategy. You'd want some, at a strategy level, you'd want to go, we're going to focus on building a composable architecture so that over time we are able to become more agile, that we're able to reduce our costs, etc. So in an ideal world, you'd have a strategy that allows or encourages the creation of reusable components. How that's funded is quite interesting as well, quite often, because very often how things are funded in an organization determine what can be done or what's done in terms of what's created technically. So again, maybe domain design, in most organizations, things are funded as projects, and I think there's accounting reasons for that. But what that often means is that it's quite difficult to build up components into enhanced components and grow them in domain models and associated components that over time are able to serve the business. So a composable architecture is not something that's created overnight, and it's not even something that's necessarily created for a project. It's something that needs to, at an organizational level, be created and looked after and planned over time, and the more that's done, the more benefits are realized over time. So ideally, you'd want to have it at a strategy level. A lot of smaller companies, smaller businesses don't even have really kind of defined strategies. So they're worse off insofar as they tend to focus on a project and getting something done, which is not necessarily the best way of building up something that's composable. And bigger organizations probably have more idea of strategy and what they want, but are quite siloed. So depending on where a project is, where it starts, what its scope is, it can also be, a composable might not be something that is pervasive through a large organization.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember it's not a panacea. Not all companies will need it, or not all companies will need it to start with. So you need to determine in terms of business strategy is, what does the strategy, necessitate a composable architecture, and to what extent, if it does need composable, to what extent does it need to be composable? Does it need to have microservices? Or if it's, say, like a greenfield project, or it's a small company and they're looking to spin up a POC, get something to market quickly, and maybe they're not in a particularly mature in terms of cultural way teams are aligned, or they don't have agile practices, or then it might be that the kind of are we allowed to say the word, a monolith might be created. But that doesn't mean that within them, that if you're creating something like a monolith, that you can't think about it in a composable way. So if you are going down that route, you'd want to go, well, actually in the future, even though we're doing this because it's going to be easy to monitor, it's going to be easy, we can get it spin up quickly. Let's make it a modular monolith where we know the different components. We've got very well defined boundaries within that monolith, and the composable components. And then at a later point, exactly where those things are. And if you need to scale things independently, and start making things more composable in terms of distributed system, then you can do that as well.
And Gordon, I was just going to bring you into this one as well, because this is kind of a trend we're starting to see in the ERP space, where clients have a tool of choice that they like, and they want to plug it into the rest of the estate, if that makes sense. So that's sort of a bit more into the ERP world, isn't it?
Well, I think we've seen it for some time at an application level, right? So if I think about what we see often in the SAP world, SAP, like other ERP platforms and their partner products, because SAP has a variety of them, would like to, of course, have a business running kind of wall-to-wall SAP solutions. Customers don't always do that. They have application level choices for their industry, for their specific use cases. And so we've seen for a long time the integration case of, no, for this step in our process, we want something completely different. And I think what's happening now in the conversation, here brings that down to a much finer level, I think, in some senses. And it's something that SAP are evolving towards. So I mentioned in the chat that there's some stuff on TechEd, which is, for those who aren't familiar, SAP's sort of annual technology conference last year, which talks about how SAP are trying to bring their various tool sets together to allow this to happen more easily. And the good point that Chris made, I think, on the chat is it's kind of counterintuitive for a large proprietary software vendor to do that. And I think that is true. There's a kind of a juxtaposition there, but the world is changing very rapidly. Small companies can come up with amazing solutions, and they can be composed at pace and for benefit. And so the ERP platforms can't and are not standing still. And so that's what we're starting to see now. But it is, and I think as Victor on the chat is making the point as well, it is a journey of 1,000 miles, I think is the last comment on there. It's an evolution rather than an overnight thing, particularly for very large companies who are, somebody mentioned it earlier, I think possibly Vaughan or Gil, that some companies are quite repetitive in what they do. The manufacturing process is quite, repetitive, but they want to get that working well and find efficiencies within it. It's not necessarily changing at pace, but there are things in most companies that change at pace and need to evolve. And so SAP and others are not standing still. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the beginning of that change. I think I mentioned earlier on, SAP and ERP platforms were transactional for a long period of time, very transactional. There came a point in the 2000s when it became a bit more about service orientation, so things being able to talk to each other at an application level. And I think this is the next year on from that, which is you have a much more granular level. The process can be changed, updated, scaled, And I think the vendors need to get used to that, and I think they are trying to do that.
No, I agree. And given the need to be quite well thought out, I guess, really from this perspective, is this sort of decision very much lying at the realm of the CTO of an organization to basically put out their stand and go, this is the future, this is where the organization is going, this is where our industry is going. We need to be on this journey. It might feel a bit tricky to start with, but the long term, the 3 to 5 year type model is kind of a bit more in their vision, if that makes sense. Vaughan, do you normally see kind of the IT exec team kind of pushing this a bit more rather than the ground up, if that makes sense?
At the moment, I think we were seeing more of the exec driving this. I think there's been, over the last maybe 3 or 4 years, there's been more of an awareness of the fact that composable architectures are possible and that they're beneficial. But I think the drive started from the ground up. It resulted because of the capability of technology and people's ability to put those things together. And I think that there's now an awareness of the benefits, and therefore it's being featured more in, like I said, 3 to 5 year plans.
Yeah, makes sense. And so let's sort of move on to sort of I guess let's talk about some advice then. Let's say, for example, let's say we've got a business that's a bit unsure, they're kind of on the cusp a little bit about whether they should be considering this kind of technology or approach or not. What would you what Gil would you suggest they do to kind of evaluate their readiness for it, if that makes sense?
In terms of evaluating the readiness for it, okay. So again, I think I've mentioned before, evaluate what their aims are. Do they actually need it? Are they organizationally aligned to it? Do they have agile practices where they've got the 2 pizza box teams that can fully own a service and own it from end to end? Do they have the agile practice like continuous integration, continuous delivery? Have they got all the governance in place? Have they got the monitoring in place? So there's quite a lot of stuff that needs to be there for a business to start adopting it, and they can do it. Like I say, it's a journey, right? So you can start off small. It doesn't have to be a big bang. You don't want it to be like that at all, really. You want to kind of take things piecemeal. So you can it's harder if it's a bigger company and you need to go through that. And across the business, nothing kind of works like that. Then that's going to be a much slower kind of tanker to turn around, if you like. But it is possible. So that, yeah.
So how would you typically start? Would you literally take a business case, a business process? I'm just thinking off the top of my head. So if the most simple one, I guess, really that everybody can relate to is when you hire a new person, things in Active Directory for Microsoft happen automatically. I guess that's probably the most simple use case you could probably ever imagine, really. So is it a case of it's breaking the processes down and kind of just picking one process and trying to solve it one piece at a time?
So I think what a good approach is to take a thin slice. So take a pilot. So you take a thin slice of functionality that touches multiple, potentially 2 or more domains, that goes across a couple of teams potentially. Because then otherwise you're kind of almost working in isolation, and unless you're creating a couple of components that interact with each other, it's not testing out as well as it could be. So I think taking that kind of a cross-functional slice across 2 or more teams is probably a good approach to take.
No, that's fair enough. And Vaughan, from your perspective, what kind of lessons learned can you offer out to the viewers and listeners that can hopefully help them on their journey, should we say?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is probably don't jump into the technology first. Understand what the business needs, define your bounded context, understand what your domains are, because it's very easy to break things down so that they become too granular. And it's equally easy to not break things down enough. So kind of identify, and it's really tricky to do. It's a bit of art, and it's a bit of a dark art to identify the appropriate level of granularity for what you're trying to achieve. I've seen the tendency of customers to jump into technology first, especially kind of containers and Kubernetes, and almost break things down to like individual functions that are wrapped to services, and so you have hundreds, well, in some cases thousands of these tiny little components that you have to then pull together. And I think that just creates more complexity, and it pushes the problems you have into different areas, but it doesn't solve any. It doesn't actually benefit the organization. So understand the business, break it down, identify the level of granularity, and then select tools that depending on the company's kind of the technologies that they're comfortable with and that they use, select the appropriate tools, and invest in the teams that are going to be doing this work. Make sure that in terms of their maturity, they have good practices around DevOps and design, and they understand to take all the things we've spoken about before. It takes investment, because the teams on the ground that have to pull all of this together now need to be kind of multi-skilled. They need to understand quite often different levels of the stack, and potentially even then different, some, if you're using microservices, you might have some components that are written in a particular language. So you need to make sure that, in terms of the implementation, that there's this kind of good practice around and some kind of sense around what's going to be used to written components, how it's going to be pulled together, etc., etc. So it's invest in the people and focus on the business aspects of it.
I think one thing that we haven't really touched on is discoverability, which is really important. So you've got all of these components, and okay, how do you know about them? How do you know that? How is a team going to know that they don't need to recreate it because someone else across the business has already created it, or one of the partners has created it already? So there needs to be a way of discovering these and adopting them and using them, whether that's an API catalog, something like Backstage, and then obviously once you've got this huge ecosystem potentially, so well, okay, then you're looking at real integration challenges as well. How do you compose these together in a way that's quick without having to then you've got the dev effort of at some point you have to wire these together. So I think then to look at what is the next step of the composure, and you need to look at things like adaptive integration. So there's new technologies that are coming on board, which we are looking at, that will help to compose those, which basically they compose the services without actually making any explicit wiring. So it kind of automatically adapts to the changes, even if there's traditional kind of contracts and interfaces would normally be a breaking change. I can go into that a bit more, but yeah, so there's different facets you need to look at that I think haven't explored, but it's obviously it's a massive subject.
And that perhaps brings us nicely quite onto the kind of future trends, I guess, really from perspective. So where do you kind of see this kind of moving in the future? I'm going to pick Gordon to start with, perhaps, actually, because he's kind of maybe touched on this from an ERP perspective as to start with. But where do you see this going in, let's say, I don't know, 2, 3, 5 years time, for example?
I think from the SAP side of it, which I'm involved in, or ERP, I think it's going to become much easier and part of the product set to be able to see end-to-end processes as a series of steps in a process, but then for us in the IT world to be able to drill down underneath and see exactly what elements are making that process up and which things can be swapped out. And I suspect it will become very easy that the vendors will make it as easy as possible to do that, either through technical work involving developers and a third-party service, or the kind of advent and increase of low-code, no-code with relatively little technical work. SAP have described some of that already, and how they're going to bring in a number of their sort of tool sets together, probably under the banner of Signavio as well, to see the overall process. For those who are familiar with that, it's only something they've acquired a couple of years ago, so they're at the very beginning of that process. So I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see it built into the model, that the process will be something you can drop right down into the detail of within SAP and move things around and swap things out for composable components along the way.
And Vaughan, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think Gil's touched on kind of integration automation, or data integration. So the ability to kind of orchestrate or multiple APIs without having to spin up a new team, literally taking your spec, maybe annotating it, dropping it into a repository, and then having it available immediately. So you don't have to spin up a team to call, to learn 5 or 6 APIs and then make the calls and orchestrate everything. So that's one area. We're also seeing quite a lot of work going on in AI. So with distributed systems, where you've got lots of granularity, you have exponentially more metrics and logs, and that means that there's if something goes wrong, there's all this potentially like log data. It's just the volume of it is huge, and humans are struggling to assimilate it and identify kind of the root causes. So we're working with a partner, for example, that has a visualization tool, but is using AI to ingest log data and is really good at identifying a root cause really quickly, and then suggesting giving you steps to actually how to resolve the issue. So it's about, I think AI more and more is going to play a role in various aspects of what we're doing, because I think it's probably able to manage complexity better than humans.
No, I think I totally agree, and it would be unfair of us to have a conversation without mentioning AI as well. So somebody won the bingo card on that one. Right, no, I think so. We're drawing this to a close from that perspective, looking at the time from that angle as well. So I'd like to just thank everybody that's taken part in the session today. Hopefully, it's been really useful and enlightening for those that have joined. We've talked all through, briefly speaking, what Composable is from that perspective, and I've certainly learned some new IT jargon, should we say, to keep up here in my memory bank for later, and indeed the benefits, some of the pitfalls, the challenges that the companies have to go through. They need to be a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more strategic in these kind of decision makings as we go as well. And indeed where this whole trend is going in the future. So I'd just like to thank everybody on the panel. Thank you very much for taking the time today. And indeed, if anybody has any other questions or any other comments in terms of feedback questions, or just want to chat about this in more detail, please reach out to the team. We'll be more than happy to entertain a conversation and help educate further. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a great day, and see you later soon. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.